Hello, everyone, and welcome to Victim Survivors with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, Important Factors to Consider. My name is Ashley Stewart-Griffith, and I am the Advocacy Support Specialist here at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I'm joined today, we've partnered with the ARC Minnesota of the Greater Twin Cities and the Sexual Violence Center to create this webinar for all of you. So I'm going to let these folks take it away in a little bit here, but first I'm going to talk a little bit about logistics. So as of right now, all of your lines are muted, and we will unmute you towards the end of the webinar for a Q&A session. When we do unmute your lines, you can ask a question. You'll have to press *7 to unmute yourself, and then to mute yourself again, you'll press *6. I will remind you of that later. I don't expect you to know it right now. But yeah, I just wanted to let you all know that your lines are muted. And if you do, throughout the course of this webinar, have a question, you can enter it in the chat function. Be mindful, in the chat function there is a drop-down menu, and if you want to send the message just to the panelist, you can go ahead and just click panelist. Otherwise, if you want to submit your question to everyone, go to the drop-down panel and click all attendees and panelists. So with that, I will let these folks introduce themselves and get going on the webinar.
Thank you, Ashley. Hi, I'm Georgianne Rumsey, and I'm a project director at the ARC Minnesota. And joining me today are...
I'm Amy Dare-Waller. I'm the Disabilities Grant Coordinator with the Sexual Violence Center.
And I'm Katie McDermott, the Advocate Associate at the ARC Minnesota. Here are the learning objectives for today's training. You will understand that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience sexual violence at a higher rate and have many obstacles to access services. You will know the basis of people's first language. You will feel comfortable responding to a survivor with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You will learn about the programs and services of the ARC of Minnesota, Greater Twin Cities region, and the Sexual Violence Center.
So before we get into the meat of our training today, I wanted to share a little bit with you about the collaboration between the ARC Minnesota, Greater Twin Cities region, and the Sexual Violence Center. The ARC has worked with the Sexual Violence Center since 1999, and in 2013, we received a grant from the Department of Justice, the Office on Violence Against Women. This grant has created an opportunity for these two agencies to create a deeper collaboration and to improve how both agencies support victims with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Our mission is that we will work together to provide services that respect and empower victims, and we will help victims get the skills and resources they need to heal.
Since 1985, the Sexual Violence Center has been serving youth and adult victim survivors of sexual violence 12 years of age and older. The Sexual Violence Center works in Hennepin, Carver, and Scott counties, with services coordinated out of our office in Minneapolis. Our mission is to end sexual violence and abuse by challenging rape culture, educating the community, and supporting victim survivors. We never turn anyone away from services if they live outside of the counties we serve, but we often refer people to a local agency that has connections with more specific resources to help. This webinar is focused on sexual violence specifically as it relates to people with disabilities. This topic can be uncomfortable and triggering for some people. We want to remind people to step away and take care of themselves in whatever way they need to. Our services include a 24-hour crisis line where people can get support from a trained advocate anytime. This line runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and is our most used service. Some people call when they're having a flashback to a previous assault, and some people call wondering how to support a friend or loved one who has experienced an assault. Some people call immediately after they've experienced sexual violence. And really, we're there to support people at any point if they need help or support regarding sexual violence. We also offer one-to-one counseling with our trained advocates, and group peer counseling is available to provide ongoing support for victim survivors. Medical advocacies are available for people when they go to a hospital for a forensic exam after a sexual assault. And legal advocacy is available for people as they file police reports, go to court for reasons related to sexual violence, or just need an advocate with them as they complete any legal documents.
The ARC supports the rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. We help them to include and participate in their communities. We are all here to help individuals and their families achieve a good life. It is not about what the system will provide, but about what people with intellectual and developmental disabilities want in life. When parents of kids with disabilities first started the ARC 70 years ago, there were really no systems and no services. The parents then changed the world through grassroots action, and today the power is still the bedrock of the ARC. When people share their passion and work together, they achieve great things. The ARC Minnesota serves many counties throughout the state. There are different regions throughout the state where staff and volunteers are there to support the mission of the ARC. The ARC nationwide has more than 700 chapters. Our services span the lifetime. Our staff can help with issues such as early intervention, education, changes to adulthood, employment, housing, healthcare, guardianship, person-centered planning, and a lot more.
So intellectual and developmental disabilities are lifelong and include persons with Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, Fragile X syndrome, and more. With the exception of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is caused by a mother drinking alcohol during pregnancy, the cause for intellectual and developmental disabilities is often unknown. It can and does happen to anyone. Intellectual disability is a below average cognitive ability and has three primary characteristics. One is related to the intelligence quotient, or the IQ, which is between 70 to 75 or below. Another characteristic is that there are significant limitations in the everyday life activities of a person with a intellectual disability, and that the onset of the disability occurs before the age of 18. An intellectual disability is diagnosed through the use of standardized tests of intelligence and adaptive behavior, but it is not determined by IQ alone. Our intelligence really refers to our general mental capacity. It involves our ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. Sometimes intellectual disability is also referred to as a developmental disability, which is a broader term that includes autism spectrum disorders, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, developmental delay, and other disorders that occur during the developmental period from birth to age 18. The major differences are in the age of onset and the severity of the limitations, and the fact that the person with a developmental disability may or may not have a low IQ. The effects of intellectual and developmental disabilities vary considerably among people, just as the range of abilities varies considerably among all people. Typically, children may take longer to learn to speak, walk, or take care of their personal needs. They may need assistance with getting dressed or eating longer than what a typical child would learn those skills. It may take students with intellectual disabilities longer to learn in school, certain topics or certain areas in school. As adults, some will be able to lead independent lives in the community without paid supports, while others will need significant support throughout their lives. In fact, a small percentage of people with intellectual disability will have serious lifelong limitations in day-to-day life. However, today, with early intervention, appropriate education, and supports as an adult, every person with an intellectual disability can lead a satisfying, meaningful life in the community. You can find more information about people with intellectual disabilities by going to the Learning Center on the ARC Minnesota website. From this point forward in our webinar, we will use people with intellectual disabilities in our presentation.
People with intellectual disabilities face the highest risk of being victimized. Let us review and take a closer look at some statistics to get an idea of how big the problem is. How many people are at risk? This is the largest majority group, the most diverse. They are living, working, and contributing members to their communities. According to the American Community Survey's results from 2010 to 2014, about 14% of the U.S. population, 12 years old and older, living outside of the institution and had a disability. Up to 89% of people with intellectual disabilities have mild impairments. This can make it harder to identify the disability. There are a number of factors that increase the risk of people with disabilities to experience abuse. People with disabilities tend to experience abuse more and at the higher severity than individuals without disabilities.
When we talk about risk, we can also think of vulnerability. In order to understand vulnerability to being a victim survivor of sexual violence, it is important to know the ways that people with disabilities have been viewed in the past and still to this day that continue negative beliefs and create barriers. The three ways of thinking about disability all focus on the person in a negative way. In the gold box, the left box, is an explanation of the moral model way of thinking. In this way of thinking, disability is the same thing as sin or evil. People with disabilities are suffering or being punished for someone's bad behavior, either their own or a family member's bad behavior. This is the earliest known way in which people with disabilities were viewed in society. The orange box, the middle box, is the triumphant or resilient explanation that views having a disability as a personal tragedy that people must try hard to overcome. People without disabilities may be in awe or impressed by the achievements of a person with a disability, but they still view disability in a negative way. The last way of thinking, explained in the blue box on the right side, the medical model, is the most widespread way of thinking about disability today. People are seen as sick, damaged, or broken. Disability is a problem that must be fixed, and professionals know best. Most of our policies and services, past and present, for people with intellectual disabilities come from this medical model way of thinking. This includes the term vulnerable adult. Many of the laws and protections the state has for people with intellectual disabilities are based on this medical way of thinking. All three of the individual or the person is the problem ways of thinking about disability are rooted in ableism. Ableism is discrimination against people with disabilities. Ableism begins with the belief that because people with disabilities are not typical of the non-disabled majority, they are inferior or not as worthy as others. There are many prejudicial beliefs and attitudes that contribute to ableism. Let's review some of the beliefs. The language may seem harsh, but that is because the beliefs and attitudes are harsh. They are very damaging and hurtful to people with intellectual disabilities. The first, always a child. Many times people with intellectual disabilities are viewed and treated as children, regardless of their age. The next, someone to feel sorry for. They are viewed as people no one would envy and people no one would ever want to be. A menace or threat to society. Many people with intellectual disabilities are seen as people to be feared or to be protected from. The next, sick and suffering. They are seen as people who are sick and suffering so that they must be taken care of. They do not work or live productive lives. They are expected to be passive recipients of treatment and services. Seen as a burden to society, that they are not normal and that their specialness requires accommodations that are costly to society. That they're ugly, unattractive, and sexless. that they're viewed as damaged people, therefore not beautiful, not attractive or sexy, or seen as asexual, not interested in sexual activity or intimacy. That they're incompetent or having no life skills, and that they view their incompetence is based upon the non-disabled person's perception of disability. And finally, freaks and oddities, that people with intellectual disabilities are seen as spectacles to gawk at, laugh at, condemn, and to bully. Ableism isn't just about beliefs or attitudes. Rather, it is the beliefs and attitudes that result in discrimination, segregation, social isolation, and unfair social and economic policies. That means that people with disabilities are not treated equal to people without disabilities. This limits opportunities to fully participate in our society. From a traditional or individual is the problem way of thinking, people with disabilities are the problem. People with intellectual disabilities are expected to be passive recipients of services aimed at curing or at least managing their impairment. Services are best provided by many different professionals, often in separate special settings. And you may be familiar with some of those that are typically group homes. In the past, in the state, we had state institutions, and you may have heard the terms sheltered workshops or day rehabilitation programs.
The individual is the problem way of thinking has led to people with intellectual disabilities being presumed to be vulnerable because of individual impairment or differences in how their brain or body works. Individual impairment can also be called personal attributes or personal characteristics. From this way of thinking, the vulnerability to sexual violence is because of personal characteristics such as needing help with activities of daily living. These can include assistance with using the bathroom, getting dressed, bathing, taking medications, preparing meals, scheduling and attending doctor's appointments, or all those activities that take place during our daily lives. It could be a lack of self-advocacy skills, ability to speak up for themselves, or having relationships limited to a few people, such as service providers or family members. Victim survivors may not recognize they are being abused, or if they are aware, they may live in fear of retaliation, especially if a caregiver is the one abusing them. They may be less able to physically defend against an attack. Perhaps they're in a wheelchair, use a walker, or have physical characteristics that make it difficult for them to defend themselves. There may be a difference in how they communicate. They may not use words. They may use a device to communicate or use interpreter services. There may be a lack of learning about healthy relationships and basic sex education. They may not even have the ability to name body parts. Oftentimes, people with intellectual disabilities are separated from people without when they're in school, so they often do not get any sort of sex education. If they don't have the ability to name their body parts or know what the functions of their body are, then they may not know how to report abuse or how to explain what has happened to them. There may be a lack or denial of education, so not having access to adapted materials or institutions like colleges and public schools, which can limit their potential for income and prevents them from becoming fully independent or getting out of an abusive relationship. Victim survivors may not know who to or how to report. The criminal justice system is very complicated and, again, can be completely inaccessible. And then, along with that, there's inaccessible public and private sector services caused by the lack of readily available ways to engage in effective communication. And so this includes our advocacy organizations, victim services, etc. In addition, caregivers may have a level of trust with the service provider that could impede their own judgment if abuse is happening. They might be reluctant to trust their instinct, and they might even fear retaliation if they report a provider for abuse. Offenders may perceive a person with disabilities as weak, vulnerable, or less likely to report, and think that this makes them easy targets. This way of thinking about vulnerability holds the person responsible for their own victimization. On the left-hand side of the slide are 4 more personal characteristics or attributes that are believed to make people with intellectual disabilities vulnerable to sexual violence. The problem with this way of thinking about vulnerability is that it ignores that most of the personal characteristics are not actually fixed characteristics of the person. They're not born with these characteristics, but they learn them. Most of the characteristics that are believed to make people with intellectual disabilities more vulnerable are a direct result of opportunities and experiences, or the lack of knowledge, opportunities, and experiences, under the power and control of other people, such as parents and other family members, and professionals like teachers, case managers, and others. Let's examine each of the 4 personal characteristics believed to make people more vulnerable. Learned helplessness. People with intellectual disabilities are not born helpless. Rather, they learn to be helpless as a direct result of how they are treated by others. Learned compliance. People with intellectual disabilities are not born agreeing with people or following directions anyone gives. Rather, they, again, learn to be compliant because they're trained and taught to be compliant, expected to be compliant, and they're often punished for not doing what they're told. A desire to please others. People may be more compliant out of a desire to please others because they want to be included. They want to be accepted and liked by others in a society that often excludes and belittles them. And underdeveloped personal boundaries. They may not have a sense of personal boundaries because their personal boundaries are repeatedly being broken by others. For example, if a person needs personal cares done in their daily life, they may not be able to choose when they receive those cares or who is providing those cares. All of these reasons for increased vulnerability occur in relationship with other people in the places where they live, learn, work, play, and worship. Furthermore, none of these personal characteristics are the cause of sexual violence. Perpetrators of sexual violence are the cause and must be held accountable.
Excuse me. Who tends to commit the abuse? 40% of the violence against persons with disabilities is committed by people that victim knows well or has a casual acquaintances. For a person without a disability, it is only 32%. 11% are parents, children, and other relatives. This is the highest percentage who commit the violence. For persons without disability, it is 7%. Only a small portion of the abusers are strangers to the person with a disability. Often, those abusers have access to many persons with disability, even through the rules and regulations to prevent abusers from working as caregivers. More work is needed in this area.
It is hard to get good statistics about sexual violence, but studies consistently show that people with disabilities experience sexual violence at higher rates than people without disabilities. 27% of women with disabilities reported lifetime sexual violence, compared to 12% of women without disabilities. 14% of men with disabilities reported lifetime sexual violence, compared to 4% of men without disabilities.
Why do we think violence is so much higher against people with intellectual disabilities? Well, 70% of people with disabilities rarely report for individual reasons. And when people with disabilities do not report, the abuse continues. It is not about people with intellectual disabilities being vulnerable. It is about the world we live in that treats people with intellectual disabilities as less than those without intellectual disabilities.
There are many types of abuse. For example, financial exploitation, neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. But there are specific situations that deem how abuse occurs as it relates to a person with disabilities. Some abuse against people with disabilities does not easily fit into the traditional categories. There are examples provided on the power and control wheel for people with disabilities and their caregivers. They can be subtle or overt. be intimidation. This could be raising a hand but not actually hitting someone, or destroying a treasured piece of their property. Emotional abuse, so blaming or making comments about the person related to their disability, calling them stupid, making fun of them. Isolation, refusing access to family and friends. If someone cannot drive, schedule rides themselves, take a bus themselves, or anything like that, they have limited options for getting away from the person who's abusing them. People may minimize, justify, and blame. They tell people something like, you made me get mad, no one will believe you if you tell. They may withhold, misuse, or delay needed supports. This could look like over-medicating a person to sedate them, or withholding their meds to make them sick or uncomfortable, or even destroying or taking away communication devices. Economic abuse, using the person's money for their own benefit. If someone controls your money, you're really stuck in a situation. And caregiver privilege, depriving or invading someone's privacy or autonomy. So not letting them have privacy in their bedroom or in a bathroom or within any space of their home. Coercion or threats, so using consequences and punishment to gain compliant behavior. After this webinar, we will send a copy of the Power and Control Wheel and the Equality Wheel. The Equality Wheel gives examples of nonviolent interactions that support interdependence for the person with disabilities.
There are many reasons why people with intellectual disabilities are caught in the circle of victimization. Most of the reasons are based on fear. They may feel threatened or think they did something to cause the abuse. Many times they have not been taught about what abuse is. Many times they fear that they will be hurt even more if they say something. Many times they experience many barriers to reporting, or if they do report, investigation takes a long time or may not even happen at all. Many times there are no trials or convictions, or offenders are available to re-offend. Many times they are not believed, especially if it's a family member or a trust person. Many times they are not referred to therapy or rape crisis programs, or if they are the provider, it is not able to meet their needs. This is why the victimization continues.
There are many systemic barriers that prolong the violence to people with disabilities and make it difficult to end abusive relationships and situations. These barriers include attitudinal. These are the myths, negative views, and stereotypes that result in the denial of equal opportunity, equal protection under the law, and equal participation in community life. So this is thinking of people as less than, thinking of them as incompetent or needing only to be cared for. There's communication, inaccessible public and private sector services who lack the ability to effectively communicate with people with intellectual disabilities. There's economic barriers. Many people with disabilities live in poverty even if they have benefits and jobs. This limits their ability to become independent and secure. There are physical barriers, architectural and structural barriers that physically prevent people from participating in all aspects of community life. This has been impacted by the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it continues to be a major obstacle for persons with disabilities. Disability services themselves, many times these services move to overprotect. They attribute abuse to the person and their failure to recognize the risk, so they're victim blaming. Many times the service professionals supporting people don't believe them. In the service system itself, many domestic violence and sexual violence services think that they are unable or lack the information to meet the needs of persons with intellectual disabilities. Also, persons with intellectual disabilities are not given the information to connect with these services in the first place.
These are some unique services that can support a person who has a disability.
The first unique service is Adult Protection Services. The Minnesota Adult Abuse Protection System strives to ensure safe environments and services for vulnerable adults and encourages reporting of suspected maltreatment. Some adults with intellectual disabilities are considered vulnerable adults on the criteria listed on this slide. Also listed are the areas of maltreatment. Reporting to Adult Protective Services is just one way to report. The ARC recommends when an assault happens that there is also the option to contact the police. Many times when working with a sexual assault victim survivor, the ARC will refer them to the Sexual Violence Center. Advocates from the Sexual Violence Center can support the person as they would anyone who is a victim of sexual assault. People can report to both Adult Protection and the police, and both of those agencies can conduct separate investigations simultaneously. There's guardianship, so some people with intellectual disabilities may have a guardian, but even under guardianship, they have the right to choose whether or not they want to have a sexual assault exam and choose if they want to connect with the Sexual Violence Center or another advocacy agency. In the past, it was common for anyone with intellectual disabilities to have a guardian placed as soon as they turned 18. This is no longer the case, and we should always assume that a person is their own guardian and able to make their own decisions. It's important that they gain power and control over their body after experiencing sexual violence. The ARC and the Sexual Violence Center as advocacy agencies help to explain how the system works and possible outcomes of people's choices.
It is important to remember that here in Minnesota, individuals who are under legal guardianship have rights that remain. The ward or protected person retains all rights not restricted by court order, and these rights must be enforced by the court. These rights can be reviewed in the statute listed on the slide. A few that we like to highlight are one of the rights is treatment with dignity and respect, that a person inside of having a guardian should receive treatment that is respectful and gives them dignity. And many times for people with disabilities, they've experienced life not having dignity and respect. Also that there's due consideration of current and previously stated personal desires, medical treatment preferences. And that's really referring to upholding their right around personal desires as it relates to medical treatment, and that they should receive timely and appropriate health care and medical treatment that does not violate known conscientious, religious, or moral beliefs of the person. In the state of Minnesota, there are 7 places where guardianship can be held, and because someone has a guardian doesn't mean that that guardian has decision-making authority in all 7 areas. So that's another thing to consider. So when Amy was talking about you assume that person can make decisions and they don't have a guardian, it's about their right to make those decisions and really listening to what it is that they want. We've talked about this earlier. People with disabilities rely on others in their daily living. They're also viewed many times as non-sexual and lack the ability to learn about sex and how to be safe, and that they are not credible witnesses. When you think about those kinds of things where people rely on others, plus they have that vulnerability, that can equal abuse. People who are in the position to support health and safety needs have access and opportunity to engage in abuse. At the same time, they are the individuals who have the greatest opportunity to prevent the abuse. Stories are powerful because they let us walk into someone else's shoes and they are memorable. We are going to play a video here in the next few moments. I want to caution you that this video may make you feel uncomfortable, in that it is people with disabilities sharing their own experiences of abuse. I encourage you to take care of yourself And as you watch, consider how you might support a victim with a disability inside of your work.
I got beat up by staff.
Cheryl was punching me in my
He
penis.
was kicking me, punching me. Said she was about to hit me.
Sexually assaulted,
I was sexually
Hurt.
raped, no one
Really
believes it.
scared.
I had a lot of anger.
I was scared.
Did I do
She
something wrong?
didn't do
Racial
want me
abuse.
to talk.
Took me to
I've
arrest
My
seen
me.
all
lips
that.
with cigarettes.
Inside the
I
body.
tried to have him stop.
And then I asked myself, why am I in this way if all we're doing is being hurt?
What is the reason why you won't believe us? If you think that this is a story, a lie that we have made up,
Well, I did believe. I don't want to tell my story enough to be believed.
I am going to tell you a very ugly story. It is a real fact, okay? Cheryl started abusing me. She put me outside when it is snowing without my shoes on. Cheryl tried breaking my legs. Cheryl and Tim hit me with the wood ruler on my ankles, and the wood cutting board, and the pot out of the kitchen, and Cheryl and Tim used very, very, very hot water on my feet. Cheryl unprogrammed my liberator because Cheryl didn't want me to talk. Cheryl pushed the ruler down my throat and said it is a slow way to die.
I need help at night. Well, she assisted. My job was to help me at night when I had to go to the bathroom and stuff. And she got mad because she had to keep on getting up. Well, I was a little scared because I had the feeling she was going to hit me. Because sometimes when people raise their voice, that is the next thing happened. And I made some phone calls to get the person out. And the same day I had that meeting, the same day they fired her. But I was concerned about the other people. Because I know sometimes when you fire somebody, they say you fire them, that end up putting them somewhere else, and somebody else will get hurt. Living in an institution, it was smelly, not clean, and I got beat up by staff. I got beat up by roommates that I had when I was living in Park. I was getting beat up by them too. Nobody ever talked about the subject. It wasn't an issue. It's like swept underneath the rug. Like everything else of the system has been swept.
Carry it with you all the time. I was sexually abused when I was 10 years old by a person in the show workshop. I think he liked to pick on people with disabilities because they wouldn't be able to tell. It still haunts me after 49 years. Because I'm not sure if it's going to happen. May happen again, may not. I don't know.
Reality didn't hit me for a very long time. Because I was thinking that I was in a dream world somewhere. I wasn't here. I felt that I did something that attracted this to happen to me. So I felt not clean. At this time, there were no words in my head how to listen to my parents, and also accept that I'm a victim.
Enough is enough, you know, with the system, you know. You're living in an institution, you gotta be safe. If you're living in a community, you gotta be safe. So the community is safetyness.
Makes me feel a little bit better every day that I do. That somebody's out there listening, and they're not putting me down for being disabled. You know, it's being not being able to defend myself.
We're strong. Sometimes you can't kick ass. Push the person off. The only thing you do is use your voice. I say, no, stop.
It is very hard, but I am trying to move on with my life.
It's not just looking at me on videotape, but what are you doing about it? What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do today?
So the video highlights many of the areas that come up for people with disabilities with the individuals who shared their stories. The way in which communication devices can be taken away from someone to limit their ability to share their story, to share something with other people. The unique fears that people with disabilities have when reporting, and their fear about retaliation, not just by that person, but by other people that may serve them. And the comment around a person living in an institution and being abused by staff and people who live with them, while we don't have large state institutions anymore, there are still places where people live that experience what that man described he experienced in the institution. And also the point about a person who talked about being abused as a child and that haunts them still today, which is very similar to other victim survivors who access sexual violence centers. Because they haven't had that access to professionals at sexual violence centers who are there to listen and been trained to listen to them. They live their life being re-traumatized by that experience. And then finally, about making a community that looks at how do they create safety, because community is safety for people. And for many people with disabilities, their community is quite small. They don't have access to other people. And many times it is limited by those who are closest to them. So those are really the points that we've been highlighting throughout, and it's really prominent in the stories that we just heard.
No persons with intellectual disability is like another. Many times there are no previous signs, especially someone who has a mild disability. Educate yourself about different disabilities and services for persons with intellectual disabilities. They can be beneficial when making a referral.
Use trauma-informed care principles when working with people with intellectual disabilities. Many persons with intellectual disabilities have experienced trauma. They have a higher than average risk of violence throughout their lives. They have experienced not being believed and possibly not being seen as credible within the criminal justice system. Understand sexual violence impacts people with intellectual disabilities psychologically, physically, and behaviorally. Understand victims with intellectual disabilities face significant barriers to obtaining services, support, or justice as crime victims. Factors that present challenges for victims with disabilities include the lack of resources and support systems, the lower rates of police follow-up, prosecution, and convictions, and again, a judicial system that is not accessible for persons with intellectual disabilities. Persons with intellectual disabilities are a group of people most at risk of being trafficked. Governments often ignore this risk factor of disability and do not include persons with disabilities in anti-trafficking efforts. Effects of trauma may be overlooked for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. When trauma history is ignored, business as usual can be re-traumatizing. A good example of this is I worked in group homes several years ago as a direct support staff, and there was a person who lived in a home I worked in who was refusing to take showers. And that refusal was seen as non-compliant. It was seen as a behavior. You know, we didn't force people to take showers, so there were health risks associated with not showering in the long term. But what we came to find out was that that person had been sexually abused and felt vulnerable and unsafe when they were showering with people. And we were able to get that person a therapist and able to work within that agency with staffing ratios to figure out something that was comfortable for that person. So they were able to shower and not continue to face health consequences. But if we hadn't been willing to do that as staff and as an agency, you know, that person would not have, we would have never found out that that person had a history of trauma, and that was the reason they weren't showering. So it wasn't that they were being non-compliant, it was that they were having a completely normal trauma response. The video that we played today helps us understand that persons with intellectual disabilities can go for years without someone listening to them. Persons with disabilities who receive services may display behaviors that are considered problem behaviors rather than a trauma response. So these could be unexplained outbursts, not taking care of themselves or refusing self-care like the example I just gave, missing appointments or not calling back advocates, and even talking over other people. This is often seen because they've never been listened to, and they're talking over other people so that someone will, with the hope that someone will listen to them, and because they've often been talked over their entire life.
A victim-centered approach is very similar to a person-centered practices, and it means putting the person at the center of the issue or concern with all that you do. When we think of victim-centered approach, it's really adding that victim's wishes, safety, and well-being as the priority in all matters. We need to understand that how they act can be tied to a history of trauma. For example, trauma survivors often don't remember events in a linear way, and that they may tell you a story of trauma that is confusing or out of order, and that's a normal response to trauma. So for people with disabilities, it'll be important in sharing their story to take pauses and allow that space to happen in finding their words to share their story. Consider the experience that they have and the self-identity, their self-identity, that those matter more than the labels or diagnosis. And that many times we ask first about their disability, not necessarily about what has been their experience, why are they there, and what is it that they need to share, and what is the story that they have, rather than what is your disability.
Use people's first language. It is important to remember that people with disabilities are people first, and their disabilities does not define who they are. It is important because the way we speak or write about someone greatly affects the images and attitudes about them. This can leave behind a positive or a negative impact. Ask how you can help. When giving a chance, many are able to tell you what they need. Check in with them, ask them if they understand. Don't assume they understand. They may not read or write. Give them time to think. Treat people with disabilities how you want to be treated. Speak slowly. Don't give too much information all at one time. If they are an adult, talk to them as an adult. Be patient and listen closely until they have the opportunity to finish telling their story. They may need to pause or take a break. Treat them with dignity and respect as they are sharing a situation that was very traumatic. If you don't understand them, ask kindly for them to repeat themselves because you want to understand. Ask if they use sign language or a communication board or electronic communication device to share their story. Listen without judgment or shock. This is a very scary process. The person you hurt them may be their primary caregiver. This could be a family member or a friend. Listen to their story. Believe what they are telling you. Some people may be worried about getting someone in trouble. How you respond can make a difference in what they will share. Let them know if you need to be willing during the interview. Let them know who the report will be shared with. Listen to what questions they may need about the reporting progress and how it works. In my life, I have many different people who support me. It is important for me to know who, why, and what they are there for and what they will do. I need to know what to expect right now when you are interviewing me. I also need to know what will happen after you leave. Who will follow up and what will happen? Will you call me on my phone? Where and with whom do I feel you can leave a message with? What if I have more questions? Who do I call? When you leave a business card or other resource I can access for help. Be clear about your role so the individual knows what your role is and what they should expect from you. You may need to provide materials. Use plain language in how you speak and information that you leave for them. Plain language are words that are easy to understand. Any information you leave should be in bigger type font, considered 12 to 14 font arrow or point arrow font. You may need Braille documents if someone can't see. Pictures can help to explain what is happening. Our collaboration created a picture guide to the sexual assault exam and how it's being used in most hospitals in Hennepin County. We are currently developing a picture guide to explain who is a mandating reporter. Offer options when the victim with a disability has a decision and choices to make. You may need to break down options and choices. Drawing out a diagram or a flow chart may be helpful. Let them know what other services may need to be available to them. Think about how you can provide decisions and choice inside of your investigation. Today, you have learned about the negative attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes. Think about your own biases in these areas. How do you check your biases at the door? This is important so people with disabilities have equal access and equal protection under law. Take the opportunity to understand the barriers and unique to persons with an intellectual disability. We can experience a high level of isolation in our lives. This makes it easier to be re-victimized. While there have been major efforts to improve physical access, but these barriers still exist. Many communities advocacy, and victim services need training to support people with intellectual disabilities. No reporting these crimes continues. We must address this reason so that people with intellectual disabilities will get access to justice in the courts. Advocacy on your own behalf is limited. Just with many crime victims, we need tools and supports and to fully participate. Victims of a crime have a right to an advocate. Make sure they are provided with one. An advocate from a sexual violence center or the ARC advocate can work together to make sure the person has appropriate supports and services. Every state has a victim's bill of rights and the crime victim compassionate programs. Sexual violence center advocate can explain it to the person and to their guardian if they have one. Every person has a support network. The network may be parents, siblings, other relatives, guardians, social worker, direct support professionals. Most people with disabilities have someone who assists them with certain aspects of their life. Help them to find how they can use their support network. Our collaboration has developed some outreach materials. We use them to get people with intellectual disabilities connected to the ARC and the Sexual Violence Center. Here is one of the outreach materials. It is an important message on the front. Every person has a right to safety and the right to live their lives free from sexual violence. Sexual violence is never okay. People with IDD experience sexual violence 7 times more often than people without disabilities. People with IDD rarely report these crimes. We developed this flyer so anyone could share it with someone to connect to the ARC or the Sexual Violence Center. Persons with disabilities are looking for a confidential resource to talk with. The Sexual Violence Center can also be a resource for secondary survivors like parents. Persons can call today or a month or a year or 5 years for the time of the experience of sexual violence. People with intellectual disabilities live their lives very isolated. They need to know how to connect with advocates, hospitals, or police. On the back is the contact information for the ARC and the SVC. We have created a poster that can be shared. We want to share this poster at local community boards, in grocery stores, coffee shops, churches, city office buildings.
Some of the other materials that we've developed through our collaboration are the Sexual Violence Center's Guardianship policy and procedure. This basically guides advocates to focus on the victim survivor and to advocate for that victim survivor's wishes. We touched on guardianship a little bit earlier and how oftentimes guardians are referred to and to direct what happens to a person, and that might include whether or not they get a sexual assault exam or whether or not they report, but really that person has a right to make those decisions for themselves. So it's important that advocates know that guardians can't override those specific wishes. We created a picture guide to the sexual assault exam, which we have in all of our medical advocacy kits at the Sexual Violence Center, and is also at most of the hospitals in Hennepin County. This picture guide is a breakdown of the steps of the sexual assault exam and includes pictures. It's useful not only to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but also to people who are in the midst of trauma and need something explained and broken down for them. And we've developed online and in-person trainings. So The Sexual Violence Center provides training around trauma-informed services and Sexual Violence 101 at the ARC. And the ARC provides training at SCC around working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Our current collaboration grant has 7 initiatives. Our first is Staff Comfort and Capacity, which focuses on trainings for both the ARC and SVC, and our staff, volunteers, and interns. These trainings build our knowledge and skills so we are equipped to support persons with intellectual disabilities who contact our agencies for support. Our Access and Safety Initiative is an area of our work focused on creating more access and safety at the Sexual Violence Center and the ARC. We have a team of staff and volunteers from each agency annually complete a review of the agencies and make recommendations to our leadership, specifically around access and safety. A member from the ARC Self-Advocate Advisory Committee is part of the review team. This is important because they have the lived experience of being a person with an intellectual disability, and they always have unique insight to share. We also work on policies and procedures. Our collaboration has identified areas to revise or develop guidelines, policies, and procedures. They focus on increased safety, confidence, comfort, and empowerment when supporting persons with intellectual disabilities. During this grant period, we are developing guidelines for serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have been harmed and who have done harm for the ARC. And then we are creating guidelines that identify when and how to screen someone for safety. At the Sexual Violence Center, we'll create a policy and procedure for universal screening for accommodations when persons access services at our location.
Our fourth area is about resources, and it's an area where we look at developing tools as resources to support people with intellectual disabilities who've been victimized. During our first grant period, we developed a picture guide to explain the sexual assault exam. We also developed a picture guide for safety planning that the ARC and the SVC advocates can use when supporting a person. We discovered during our work on the first grant that many people with intellectual disabilities do not understand what mandated reporting is and their rights. We found that people don't understand what and who is a mandated reporter, how a mandated reporter can impact a victim survivor's recovery, and what happens after a report is filed. Our collaboration believes that victim survivors with intellectual disabilities need to understand mandated reporting. What does it mean when someone says to you that they are a mandated reporter? We believe a picture guide will support victim survivors to understand mandated reporting and what decisions and choices they have. During the first grant, we conducted focus groups with self-advocates, and they said that they wanted training on what is sexual violence. So we are now developing a curriculum and tools for a support group. The support group would be just for victim survivors with intellectual disabilities, and that will be offered as a service at the Sexual Violence Center. Currently at the Sexual Violence Center, if someone with an intellectual disability wanted to join a group, they currently can join a group, but we know that for some people with intellectual disabilities, they want to be in a group with other people with intellectual disabilities because the sexual violence that they experience may be unique in their experience in life. And we have an effort with law enforcement. We've decided to focus on a relationship, building a relationship with one law enforcement agency in Hennepin County in order to conduct an environmental scan and create a recommendations report. We've created a survey that employees at the law enforcement agency will take, and we will summarize their answers and get feedback in a focus group. We'll conduct focus groups at the law enforcement agency, and we will also conduct a focus group with self-advocates to also get their feedback. The report will help us identify and develop resources and/or training to support law enforcement when working with victim survivors with intellectual disabilities in their community who have been victims of sexual violence. And then our final area is outreach. We know that it is important to share information about sexual violence and the impact on people with intellectual disabilities. And you saw the flyer as well as the poster that we've developed. And the audiences that it is geared towards is people with intellectual disabilities, parents and other family members, as well as direct service staff who support people with intellectual disabilities. We are going to be sharing the flyer and poster with identified groups, and we will provide presentations to those groups interested in learning more about the resources that the ARC and the Sexual Violence Center have to support victim survivors, as well as how the Sexual Violence Center can also support secondary survivors like caregivers, parents, and other professionals. So how would you build a welcoming, trauma-informed organization that can meet the needs of persons with intellectual disabilities who are victims of sexual violence? Maybe you've been thinking about how to build your capacity, confidence, and comfort to support persons with intellectual disabilities. If you are part of a SMART team or SART team, think about having someone from the ARC or a disability service as a member of that team, or consider a smaller team of interested members to look at creating an accessible, welcoming, safe place for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The collaboration of our two agencies came from knowing about the statistics and wanting to leverage our expertise to build comfort and capacity in both of our organizations. Initially, representatives on our collaboration included project directors located at both organizations, and then also agency representatives that could influence change as we developed our collaborative mission, vision, and important values. As we got further into our collaboration work, it became evident that there was a person missing that could really make a big difference in our strategic areas. We began to develop a plan to incorporate a person with intellectual disabilities as a part of our collaboration. We developed a plan for full participation that included, but not limited to, thinking about our bi-weekly committee meetings and our bi-weekly input meetings that we have at each organization, how that individual would have a say in any group decision that is made, and how they would be involved with representing the collaboration at events and meetings that we would be participating in as this collaboration. The plan also included the selection process, like what would the interview questions look like when talking with people that were interested, how would we orient them to our collaboration and onboard them, and what would we need to do differently to ensure that they could equally contribute. We needed to address transportation, in that people with intellectual disabilities access transportation in different ways, and it's a lot different than everyday people. And that we needed to look at the scheduling of our meetings, and that many times when our meetings were scheduled, it may not be the time which would work for a person to join our collaboration. So in doing all of that, Katie, who's our presenter here today, she currently serves on our collaboration. So Katie, could you share how we have made our collaboration committee work accessible, and so that we can learn from you in the work that we're doing?
Sure. So going over the collaboration materials, like the agenda, documents, review before the meeting, making ideas easy to understand, using colorful visual on poster boards, so I'm a visual learner, using flowcharts to break down the big ideas. I really like that our team helps me when I have questions or concerns. If I don't understand, they will explain it in a way where I can relate and understand. My team breaks down the policies and procedures to where it is helpful and easy to understand for me. Checking questions at the beginning of the meetings, it gives us time to learn about our collaboration members before we dive into the hard work. They listen to what I have to say and include my opinions in everything we do. Having a set schedule of meetings and events, attending VERA and OVW trainings, learning about the importance of our work and how to do it better. Roses and thorns, because as we all write down what we liked about the meeting and what our concerns are for the meeting going forward. That's what I like. Those are my 10 top highlight list that I like being in the collaboration. And I feel that my team really values what I have to say, because I'm also a victim survivor myself. So working on this collaboration and opening doors and making a difference for others, that's just what I do. And also I can hopefully help others go through their situation.
The other thing that Katie does is at the ARC, she's an advocate associate and she leads our self-advocate advisory committee. So some of the, well, a lot of the work that we do, we go to that self-advocate advisory committee and ask for members to give us feedback on what we're developing, in that the intended audience is people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and they've joined us in developing some of the tools, and it may not be everyone inside of that group, it may be just a few that have a specific interest in what we're working on. So really looking at how can you leverage people with disabilities inside of your work. But then also being clear and thoughtful about how you are going to facilitate those conversations and what you need them to do. Another way to look at developing a collaboration to build how you serve people with disabilities is look in your own communities and identify advocacy agencies, organizations, or community members that have an interest in supporting your agency about impacting people with disabilities who are victims of sexual violence. Look at how they can educate you to build your capacity and comfort. This work comes from how all of us are responsible for creating a community that is safe, and when violence occurs, being ready to support that person in what they need and providing choice for them to move forward. And we just have resources and references at the end that help support us in developing this presentation. And just to let you know that our project is supported by grant number 2016, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, the U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women.
Okay, so now we'll have time for questions. As Megan has chatted in the chat box, you can certainly chat in your questions. We will also unmute the lines right now, so you can ask them over the phone as well. All right, and it takes a little while for people to chat in their questions, so we'll give folks some time.
So someone asked, will you be sending out the materials your team developed as examples, and how can they access the different things you showed?
Yes, we will be sending out some of the materials. I believe we have a copy of our picture guide to the sexual assault exam and a copy of the guardianship policy and procedures used at the Sexual Violence Center. We'll also be sending out 2 power and control wheels that we referenced during this presentation, and then of course a copy of the PowerPoint itself.
If you would have questions about the tools and what we've currently developed, you could just contact either Amy at the Sexual Violence Center or myself at the ARC Minnesota Greater Twin Cities region. And we can certainly answer those questions for you or get that information to you.
So we have another question. How can an agency make their outreach in their communities more accessible to better reach victim survivors with IDD?
Well, I think I would look at the materials that you have and look at possibly if you have access to some people who would want to work with you in looking at them as far as how they understand them when they read them, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are a lot of great resources out there about plain language that certainly you can access. Many times we find in our work that we've done is that many times the font size or type size is not accessible, and that it's not large enough, as well as looking at what are we trying to communicate in those materials when we're reaching out to anybody in the community, and how is it that we can write things in a way which people can easily understand about what are the services and how to connect to that agency. So that would be a place to start, looking at what is your primary piece of literature that you share. It's not about changing everything, but what are the things that are looked at most by victim survivors who come to your agency? And we do the same thing at the ARC. You know, what are the things when people come to us for support, what is it that they're seeing first, or what are we handing to them, so that it's written in a way that has access. And if a person doesn't read, because we also talked about that in our presentation, that there's someone available there to explain it to the person and really answer all the questions that they may have if they come into your agency or if it's over the phone.
I actually have a question. So I was, as you were doing the presentation, I was just thinking, if you were an agency that had someone come in and you felt like you tried to be, you know, accommodate, but you didn't know if you were helping them as much as someone that maybe like at SVC could, if they have a specific, like more experience. Do you have any suggestions on determining if you are helping that client with the most needs of your agency, or if you should recommend them to an agency that's more experienced in the different types of clients, or what are your thoughts around that? Because I think a lot of people can get overwhelmed. Right?
So I guess my recommendation is, I don't think anybody, well, I think you understand or learn from thinking about how is it that you listen to people. And if I was sitting with someone and I wondered whether or not I was giving them information that was helpful, I would ask them, and really wait and listen. And maybe ask, what else could I do in order to support you in understanding what I'm speaking about? And certainly access, you know, or call another organization to say, what could you share with me that could build my skills and abilities around this topic area? You could certainly go to the Vera Institute of Justice. There's a lot of really good resources under their disability program that you can look at ways in which other organizations have built their capacity around supporting people with disabilities as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree with George there, that the first step would be to ask that person, ask if their needs are being met. And then also just to keep in mind that people are people, and a lot of the techniques that we're using at the Sexual Violence Center, so like trauma-informed techniques, are also person-centered techniques that are extremely effective for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I think really a lot of agencies have the skills to support this population. They just don't think, they might not think they do, or may not feel comfortable using them with the population. But really, I mean, you're just supporting a victim survivor like you would support anyone, you know, even if they do have a disability. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Like I said, feel free to type them in the chat box, or you can unmute your line and ask them over the phone.
I have another question. Do you have any suggestions or other tools for individuals, or maybe you talked a little bit about guardians and caregivers and guardians, but with like advocate confidentiality, is there any guidelines or best practices that you would suggest around, like if they feel comfortable having someone in the room, or what are your thoughts around that for different people?
Our standard practice would be to that we maintain that confidentiality with a one-on-one setting, and I'd be hesitant to include a caregiver in an advocacy session, because it could be the caregiver who is the perpetrator. So it's a very great question. But as far as I know, if we're going to be maintaining that confidentiality status, it needs to be that one-on-one session. And of course, it is important to be offering those caregivers or family members support themselves, because they might often blame themselves for their loved one experiencing sexual violence. So, but I would suggest trying to keep those sessions separate.
And really just explain that issue of confidentiality as an advocate, as a sexual violence advocate, that if that guardian or caregiver joins the conversation, what that will create. And so it's just providing that understanding, because they also are coming to a rape crisis center or a sexual violence center. They don't know what that means for a person to talk with an advocate. So it's also educating them.
And people might need to have someone, with them in the building. So maybe it's outside of a room, but they might actually need a personal care attendant to maybe help them in the bathroom or help them with other tasks as they're receiving advocacy. So it's important to be able to kind of tailor and accommodate those sessions, maybe give some more time to a session. If it's normally an hour, maybe give them an hour and a half, because they might need breaks and they might need that support person to step in at some point to offer some sort of support.
One thing I would also add to that is, I think you can just say it's standard practice that you meet one-on-one, and sometimes that can then avoid, if the person bringing them in does happen to be facilitating or covering up any violence, you're not going to raise any ire there. You're just saying, oh, our standard practice is this. Also, I think when we talk about minors as well, sometimes with youth, that's the approach. It's just saying this is our standard practice, and most people will just, that's that.
We have another question. And so they said, I have seen the triumphant and medical attitudes you explained earlier used as excuses in the system to not hold perpetrators with disabilities accountable. Are there any resources available about perpetrators with disabilities and holding them accountable?
That's a great question.
Not specific. I don't know of any specifically. I know that the ARC National has a program called Pathways to Justice, and there is a lot of resources on that particular site around people with disabilities who have been perpetrators or alleged perpetrators who've been involved with the justice system. And that would be one place that I would recommend going to look to see what resources are there. That has not yet been the focus of our work. So that's my disclaimer.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, well, we can wrap up today unless I see anything trickle in while I'm wrapping this up. So I want to thank the presenters for presenting today. We're very thrilled that you all agreed to present to this audience, and we really value this collaboration. And so, like we have said before, we will send out an email with the link to this recorded webinar. We will also send out some of the resources that were mentioned today through the webinar too. I also want you all to know that I am accessible too by phone or email, so you can certainly give me a call if you have questions afterwards too. Yeah, and I just want to thank everybody again for attending the webinar, and we're so glad that you could join us, and we will sign off. So thank you.